We're going to start. Hi, I'm Rose McDermott. I'm a professor of political science here and also in the Watson Institute. And we're here to congratulate and celebrate Tyler Jost on his wonderful new book, Bureaucracies at War, The Institutional Origins of Miscalculation. So we have a number of very distinguished panelists, but I think that we start with Tyler having a short, my understanding is you start with a short presentation, and then I can introduce the panelists as they make their commentary. So,
great. Well, thanks so much for everyone for coming, and thanks especially to Rose, Susan, Mai, and Yuhua for engaging with the scholarship. One of the things I'm most excited about today is the fact that because I drew a lot on scholarship that had originated in Americanist and comparativist traditions, it's really exciting to, even though this is a work primarily about IR and international politics, circle back, so to speak. It's the full boomerang, one might say. The central motivation of this book is the notion that is common to all of us, we probably know this, that international politics and international conflict in particular often ends up much different from the way that leaders, presidents, prime ministers, dictators think it's going to, raising natural questions of if they could see the way that it was going to turn out, would they have perhaps made a different choice? We see this in numerous instances. So I'm going to give you a couple examples that are covered in the book. So the 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War, a conflict which turns out on the battlefield to be much more arduously fought than decision makers in Beijing hoped that it would turn out. And as a result, doesn't really generate the bargaining leverage vis-a-vis Hanoi that Beijing and Deng Xiaoping in particular is hoping for. Or think about the 1962 Sino-Indian War, in which a series of policy decisions made mostly in the fall of 1961 to push Indian military forces further out along the border with China precipitate this conflict with China that ends disastrously for India, by far its worst since 1947. Or think about the 1999 Kargil War, in which a military gambit to seize heights in Kargil in contested territory in Kashmir results in an Indian backlash, and perhaps equally importantly, an international backlash that the individual depicted here on the left, Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, does not anticipate. Or if we look internal to the United States, we think about the escalation in Vietnam between 1964 and 65. The kind of miscalculation here, so different from the Iraq War, so many of the advisors that were intimately involved in the decision-making process, in retrospect, and this comes from Defense Secretary McNamara recalling, and this is a quote, "We were wrong, horribly wrong." So taking each one of these events and sort of distilling it down into a central question motivating the book is about why states sometimes miscalculate on the road to war. And there's, of course, lots of different answers to this question. There is fundamental uncertainty and unpredictability in international affairs, and there are cognitive and psychological biases which impair our ability to rationally process information. But the strand of the discipline that this book is most centrally engaged with is a tradition that began in the late 1960s and early 1970s, pioneered by Graham Allison, that's like the bureaucratic politics literature. And I would suggest that there's kind of like two core tenets, if you look hard at what Graham Allison was arguing, as well as his contemporaries were arguing, about bureaucracy and its fundamental nature. So the first is a skepticism that bureaucracy can make things better. In fact, on the, in the sort of opposite direction, bureaucracy tends to muck things up. And this kind of pithy phrase, which you might have heard, which I think encapsulates this intuition, is that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. Right, so you get bureaucracy involved, you're more likely to miscalculate. That's the kind of central proposition number one. And the second idea that's in this literature, and you have to look closely for this, but is a skepticism about the ability for institutional design to remedy bureaucratic pathology. Allison is directly and forcefully skeptical that we can design our way out of these muckiness or this propensity to design a camel as opposed to a horse. The book argues that these central propositions are both wrong and takes a sort of decidedly antagonistic approach towards them. The overall thrust of the argument is that bureaucratic participation, all else equal, does actually decrease the risk of miscalculation for one central reason. The idea is that decision makers who sit atop of states, think Lyndon Johnson, think Nehru, think Nawaz Sharif, so on and so forth, can only do so much to collect the vast amount of information that exists out there in the world. Harnessing state capacity through bureaucratic organizations and establishing connective tissue that allows those bureaucracies not just to collect information, but to send it up, allows the leaders to make decisions with a wider aperture of information available to them. Now, of course, just because you have more information does not mean that the information will be of high quality. And here is where I take issue with the second conventional wisdom within the literature. And that is this notion that you can't design your way out to have a better outcome. Here, the book argues that what institutions that leverage competition between bureaucratic organizations that have different sets of information, different sets of perspectives, and different ways of looking at the world can force them to provide better information by essentially allowing the leader to leverage the perspective of one bureaucracy to tease out deficiencies or suboptimalities in another bureaucratic organizations. The two bureaucratic organizations that I look at in the book and kind of argue are a natural pairing are foreign ministries or diplomatic ministries on the one hand, and defense ministries or military organizations on the other. And the central proposition here is that forcing a dialogue and debate between those two key organizations does improve the quality of information available to leaders. Putting this all together, and this is where the title of the book comes from, the idea is that putting bureaucracies at war at home can help leaders prevent miscalculation on the road to war abroad. This, of course, introduces a natural puzzle, right? So if this argument about institutional efficiency is right, why would leaders ever choose anything but? And the answer to this book is, I think of it as complementary to the existing literature. So the existing literature tends to tell us that institutional design management comes from a leader's personality. Mac Dessler, who was one of Allison's contemporaries in the 1970s, has this amazing phrase where he says that decision-making process is a chameleon that reflects a leader's personality. And this is, of course, true to an extent. What the book is pushing us to think about, however, is in parallel to personality, the way that domestic political environments shape a leader's institutional choices. In particular, the book proposes that there's a fundamental trade-off between institutions that offer good advice on the one hand, and institutions that provide political security on the other. The idea is that institutions that provide good advice also empower bureaucrats to be able to politically punish the leader. And as a result, when leaders are politically vulnerable at home, they actually rationally select into those inefficient, from a decision-making perspective, institutions in order to shore up their political security at home. What this means is what regulates the trade-off is domestic politics. In particular, leaders' perceptions of whether the bureaucracy has the capacity and intent to harm either their own political survival or their ability to get key legislation or agendas through, say, a legislature or implementation, so on and so forth. Putting this all together, what this suggests is that it's not just the personality of leaders that shapes the propensity for miscalculation, it's the domestic political environment which pushes and pulls on institutional design, which can raise or lower the propensity for miscalculation in international affairs. So let me just briefly talk about three of the ways in which I try to advance this argument in the book. So the first is a conceptual move, right? So when we look at the existing literature, there's this great tradition going back to Bob Jervis's work in the 1970s, Rose's work that has been going on for decades now, talking about differences between leaders. So we have typologies that think about how leaders differ across time and space. And in parallel to this literature, we have other scholars like Ken Schultz and Jessica Weeks, who have argued and given us typologies to think about the relationship between state and society and how variation between democracy and autocracy, say, affects international political outcomes. What we don't have, however, in the existing literature in IR is a way to categorize states or leaders at different times in different spaces according to the same kind of terminology that we would use in the context of democracy and autocracy. So this is where the comparativist and American tradition was so important for me. Drawing from this literature, I introduced this typology to think about the differences in institutions, formal and informal rules that regulate the flow of information between leaders and bureaucracy across time and space. And there's lots of different ways that you could sort of slice and dice this, different typologies that would be possible once you accept that this is a thing that exists there out in the world. But the thing that I focus on is information flow. And two dimensions that are depicted here in the 2x2, the leader's information search capacity, think about the connective tissue between the leader and the foreign affairs bureaucracy, that being the first dimension depicted left to right. And the second dimension, bureaucratic access to information. If you want to think about this in Cartesian, almost a little stylized format, leader information search capacity kind of refers to the vertical flow of information within the state, whereas bureaucratic access to information refers to horizontal flow of information within the state. The argument, tying this back to the argument before, the upper left-hand quadrant, that integrated institutions that pull bureaucrats in but force them to debate with one another, is the one that I sort of argue works the best. The second move here in the typology category is to gather data that maps that typology throughout the world from 1946 to the mid-2010s. So this was a big data collection effort, and you can see some of illustrative examples here of how this works. So this allows for a two-pronged methodology going forward. In testing institutional effects, I leveraged the cross-national data to perform a series of statistical analyses showing that in crises from 1946 to 2012, states with those integrated institutions that pull bureaucrats in but force them to debate tended to perform a little bit better relative to other pathological alternatives. But the crux of the empirical material is really a series of 4 case countries: China, India, Pakistan, and the United States during the early Cold War, and 9 crises that I look at in detail and process trace from the institutional design how you get better or worse information, and then whether or not you're able to sort of avoid miscalculation or charge headfirst into conflicts that don't go the way that you think. Lastly, the book tries to look a little bit further back and ask, okay, this proposition of an institutional trade-off, what evidence do we see of that? And the only common theme that I'll talk about today, we can talk more about it in the Q&A or in the discussion, is that the book finds that the moments in which states turn inward, begin to push through transformative domestic political agendas, are the moments in which you tend to get the worst, from an efficiency point of view, institutional design. So in the Chinese case, this is the succession crisis surrounding the death of this individual, Mao Zedong, the Cultural Revolution that preceded his death, as well as the jockeying between Hua Guofeng and Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s that followed his death. In the context of India, it was a transformative economic agenda of the 1950s and 1960s, coupled with a healthy skepticism about the military and fears of Praetorianism that were emerging elsewhere in South Asia that pushes Nehru into a more fragmented design. And lastly, within the United States, a country that really shouldn't be prone to fragmented institutions or suboptimal pathological institutions, they do emerge for a kind of historical peculiarity of the 1960s in which you have a leader coming into office through an assassination, not feeling clearly threatened by the advisors who surround him, and trying to push through really transformative, and I mean that in a good way, domestic legislation in the mid-1960s. So the kind of end result here is a book that is both pessimistic and optimistic. It's optimistic in the sense that I take a much rosier view of what bureaucracy can do for leaders relative to what the conventional wisdom says. But it's also keenly aware of the domestic political constraints that don't necessarily allow leaders to choose the institutions that would be best. So thanks so much for coming today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Tyler. I just wanted to mention, I see a couple of people sitting in the back. There are seats in the front down here, 1 or 2, if you guys actually, you're happy back there. Okay, that's fine. Just wanted to let you know. Okay, so thank you very much, Tyler. And we have 3 distinguished commentators. We can start with Professor Wang from Harvard. I don't know if you want to sit here or go up.
I can stay here. Yeah, thanks. Well, let me start by congratulating Tyler for writing and publishing a great book. I would go so far to say that this is the best IR book I've ever read in my life. With the caveat that I don't usually read IR books. I'm sorry for the IR people. But still, the best book I've read because I'm a comparativist. I study Chinese politics, and then I want to spend more time reading IR books after reading this book because I find a lot of inspirations from your work, Tyler. Let me start by maybe saying what I like about the book. Some highlights of the contributions, and then also maybe I would like to pose 3 questions for you to think about. One thing I really like about the book is I think, as social scientists, especially political scientists, but also economists, we usually don't assume leaders or rational actors can make mistakes, right? I think we usually rationalize whatever they do, whatever leaders choose to do, whatever governments, what policies they make, we usually try to justify their decisions and then rationalize them, because we all come from, most social scientists now come from this rational choice paradigm, and then we usually assume that they have a lot of information. It's imperfect information, but they have what they needed, and then they will make the best decision based on the information they have. And then therefore, usually government don't make blunders, right? There's no blunders, but we do know from reality, leaders and governments have blunders and they make a lot of mistakes, as we see, for example, in what's happening in the war in Ukraine. And then Putin certainly, didn't understand the costs, right, for this war. And then he certainly is making a mistake, you can argue. And then, I study Chinese politics, for example. And then when we study Chinese politics, we usually rationalize everything that the Chinese leader is doing. For example, when we see economic growth, we argue, they understand it's an autocracy. They don't have elections. There's no way to legitimize their rule. Therefore, they promote economic growth to legitimize their rule. So when we see their policies to promote economic growth, we see this is a rational policy. They do this to promote durability. Now China is struggling with the economy. The economy is slowing down now in China. And then China scholars are saying, this is rational as well, because the Chinese leaders understand with more economic growth, the economy, the middle class, the private sector will strengthen the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's why they're slowing down the economy to legitimize their rule, to promote stability, so on and so forth. So everything they do seem to be rational, right? And then we try to rationalize whatever they do. I think that's a problem, right? That's a problem among social sciences that, actually they do make mistakes. For example, now there has been a lot of discussion about whether Xi Jinping will start a war with Taiwan. Certainly, if I hope it doesn't happen, if the war happens, there will be a lot of people try to rationalize that war, to say, this is contributing to his legacy and so on and so forth. But we all know that it might be a mistake. So I think, this is the first thing I really like about the book, that is we have to acknowledge that rulers make mistakes, and then we need to understand the conditions under which they make mistakes. The second thing that I really like about the book is this is one of a few books in the last 2 decades, I would say, that are regime-free, right? That is, when you think about the cases that Tyler selected, China, US, I think that's a pair, and then India and Pakistan, right? And then they are, on 2 sides of the regime category. And then he shows that it's not necessarily true that democracies are better at solving the information problem, right? Because this has been a long-standing assumption among the political scientists that there's a democratic advantage in collecting information, right? And then we all assume that autocrats, also they need information, but they usually cannot collect the true information, right? Because people don't tell them, right? Yeah. And then for reasons because of fear, preference, falsification, ordinary citizens don't tell the truth, bureaucrats don't tell the truth, politicians don't tell the truth. So there's this autocratic disadvantage in information collection. But as Tyler shows, actually, you see this problem in democracies as well, in India, in the US. And then we really need to rethink about our obsession with regime type, I think, in political science, right? We have been doing a lot of work that focuses on regime type and then how that affects politics. But I think, democracies have a lot of similar problems with autocracies. Also, I would like to maybe make a counter argument later. This is one of my questions, that is whether it's true that autocracies are very similar with democracies in collecting information. I do think that there's something different in autocracies, but I'll like to say that later. Okay, so those are I think two things I really like about the book. Let me ask three questions. I think the first one is on this point about information collection in autocracies versus democracies. I do wonder, I want to hear from Tyler your view about your theory vis-a-vis this very popular view among scholars who study authoritarian regimes about the idea of dictator's dilemma. This is an idea proposed by Winchell, an economist, I think more than 20 years ago. And then the idea is because dictators really want information. They really want to know what's going on, for example, in the society. They want to know what's going on in the bureaucracy. And then they usually use coercion to try to get information, right? They will try to signal to people, if you don't tell me the truth, right, I will use violence. And then exactly because of this, that is, the more the dictator wants information, the less information they will have, or the less truthful information they will have, because of people's worry that if you tell the truth to the dictator, you will be punished, right? I think that's the idea of the dictator's dilemma. And then it doesn't play a very important role in your story. And then I wonder why. I do see that, democracies maybe are facing similar problems because democratic leaders also have survival concerns, and then they also sometimes have to pressure for information. But I do think that in autocracies, you do see more violent ways of pushing for information, right? That is, I can think about Mao, for example. I can think about Stalin, right, who used violent means to push for the autocracy to do things or to collect information, so on and so forth. And then in that sense, I do worry that there might be a qualitative difference between autocracies and non-autocracies, right? That is, in autocracies, there is just a higher likelihood for the bureaucracy now to submit truthful information. I just wonder how you think about this. And then the second question I want to ask is, the way I think about your theory, this 2x2 table, and then I think there are two categories of. So the best scenario is you have integrated institutions, right? That's where you have a very smooth flow of information in the bureaucracy. There's horizontal flow of information. People in different departments know each other and then they talk to each other, but also very smooth vertical flow of information. That is, the bureaucracy is willing to send that information to the ruler. So that's the ideal case, right? But then you have two non-ideal cases. One is called the siloed institution, where from my understanding, it's about the horizontal flow of information. That is, if you don't have horizontal flow of information, right? That is, different departments, they don't talk to each other. They have their own information, but they don't have ways to communicate with each other. This is called siloed institution. And then, or on the other hand, there's a second scenario, it's called fragmented institution. That is, the bureaucracy maybe have some information, but they don't send it to the ruler, right? So it's called fragmented institution. This is more about the vertical flow of information. And then you are saying that under certain conditions, the rulers might make the institutions fragmented so that the bureaucracy doesn't have the incentive to send information to the ruler. That is, vertical flow, there's some obstacles in the vertical flow. I do wonder, my understanding is, I think in all regimes, I can understand, in some situations, the ruler might not want to have horizontal flow of information between the bureaucratic organizations, right? Because the idea is, if I'm the ruler, I'm ruling, a bunch of elites, I don't want them to talk to each other, right? Because, I want you to have your information. I want that person to have his information, but I don't want you two to talk to each other because I worry about coordination among the elites. So I can understand the siloed institution. That is, I want to stop horizontal flow of information, but I don't quite understand why rulers don't want vertical flow of information. I would assume that the rulers always want vertical flow of information. That is, if I know that some bureaucratic organizations have very specialized knowledge about certain things, I would always create institutions or incentives for them to tell me, right? Because it's always in my interest as a ruler to maximize the amount of information I have, right? And then so with more information, I can have a better control. And then the way I destroy my bureaucracy, or to make sure I survive is to work on the horizontal flow, right? I don't want them to talk to each other, but I always want them to talk to me, right? So that's my question. I just want to ask why in some cases in your case studies, the presidents or the prime ministers actually want to destroy that vertical flow of information, just want more clarification on this. And then the last thing is just based on current events. I guess we are all paying attention to Trump's appointments lately in the cabinet, and then who becomes the who's going to lead the National Security Council, who's going to lead the State Department, so on and so forth. So are we wrong by paying attention to personnels? That is, if institutions are so important, in the U.S. but also in China, for example, in the U.S. it's more about partisan or ideological preferences. And in China, you can think about hardliners, hawkish people, and then the doves, the softliners, or more pro-America people, or more pro-China people. And then are we wrong that we, or maybe we shouldn't pay attention to personnel, right? So those people's preferences don't really matter. It's really the institutions, right? So, according to your story, that's what we should pay attention to, right? So it's about the rules, right? Not about who we appoint to those positions. So that's the last question I want to ask. But great work. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Tyler, do you want to respond, or shall we just move on to the additional commentary?
What are we at timeline wise? We can keep going. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah.
So our next commentator is Professor Hassan, who is from MIT.
Great. Thank you, Tyler, for having me and writing a fabulous book. And thank you to everyone for coming to this event. A special shout out to my brother-in-law over there. So I'll preface it by saying I'm not a scholar of China, the US, India, or Pakistan. I'm not a scholar of international conflict or the Cold War. So why am I here? But instead, I study bureaucracies, and especially within authoritarian regimes, but also within democracies. And as a scholar of organizations, I think there's a lot to really admire and to really like about this book in ways that'll really help move the literature on public administration, organization forward. So the first thing is that I really appreciate about this book is that it really shows how small institutional changes to things like reporting lines, the attendance of who comes to specific meetings, their formality can actually change in the short run, and how these changes actually matter for bureaucratic performance and how they matter for bureaucratic incentives. Whereas a lot of people who study the administrative state tend to think of bureaucracy as slow-moving, bureaucracy as resistant to change and inert. Instead, this book gives us real compelling evidence that the structure and the operation of a bureaucracy is not fixed, not in the short run. And I think that's a real contribution. Another thing that I really like about this book with my organization's hat on is that it gives us a really holistic view of bureaucracy. In recent years, there's been a whole cottage industry of work on bureaucracies, my work included. And I think this is in part because of parallel trends within the social sciences that's been pushing us to quantify our work, alongside the fact that bureaucracies tend to produce reams and reams of paper, right? And so many bureaucracies around the world produce a lot of stuff about, the identity of who's in these bureaucracies, how they're trained, how they're rotated, how they advance of individual personnel, as well as formal rules about how these agencies, quote unquote, should be run. And all of this, again, leads to quantification by scholars, very much, blaming myself here. But in so doing, I think a lot of this literature, by only focusing only on what's written down, a lot of this literature can tell us, sure, about individual bureaucrats and formal procedures, but not actually about bureaucratic culture, and not actually about how actually bureaucracy works on a day-to-day basis and how it actually affects outcomes. And so in a sense, existing work, while rich in quantitative data, is actually pretty thin on what we tend to think we care about. And so in this sense, Tyler's book is really, truly a breath of fresh air It recognizes that bureaucracy is more than just the sum of its parts, and gives us a really rich understanding of how these agents interact with each other. Their incentives based off of not just what's written down, but some of the informal language that presidents use, or the informal strategies that leaders put into place to either bring information forward or to stop it going from side to side. And he does this through thick description, process tracing, and amazing archival work. And so those, from the bureaucracy and organization side, things to very much applaud about this book. I'll also talk a little bit about Tyler's book from the perspective of regime studies. And, as Yuhua was saying, one of the amazing things about this book is that it focuses on cases across regime types, bureaucracies and autocracies. And this is something that, his book really shows that there are similar mechanisms at play across different regime types. And here I'll say that the Johnson case study in the U.S. Really did a lot of work to illuminate how the fragmentation of institutions, as opposed to labeling Johnson Democratic president, is what's doing a lot of the work in this miscalculation that Tyler documents. And so there's this great parallel about why Johnson chose fragmentation and the negative effects it had there with us, and very similar mechanisms at play when we think about why Mao chose fragmentation in his bureaucracy in China, and why it mattered, what mattered there. I also will add that when we think of autocratic politics and bureaucracies, we tend to think that the idea of yes men is very common there for many of the reasons that Yuhua had talked about. Incentives about being scared to report information up, for instance. But the Johnson case study in particular shows us how yes men also exist in democracies. There's a quote in here that says on page 261, if you guys have the book out, that, quote, information did reach Johnson's desk, but it was incomplete and skewed towards the beliefs that the president already had. Johnson, too, had yes men, just like other autocratic leaders that we tend to always have yes men, had them too. I also like that this book expanded our understanding of what internal threats are to different types of leaders. And so at least within the autocratic regime space, we tend to think of Sheena Greiten's classic book about internal coups and secession battles as thinking about as why it might be that autocratic leaders are threatened. In my own work, I think about social contention, collective action, or voting behavior. But Tyler's book also makes clear that threats can come from the bureaucracy as well. If we recognize that bureaucrats are those who are actually pushing the levers, and their incentives might not actually always be aligned with the leaders, then we have to think about institutional solutions that leaders can put into place to limit that threat potential. I think a really important example here is about, in the first case study in the book, about Mao and his succession plans. He really wanted to leave in place a specific legacy and was really worried about whether or not the bureaucracy would, in a sense, muck it up. And so changing the nature of the bureaucracy, because he was worried about the threat that bureaucracy had to his potential moving forward, or his reputation after he was gone. I think that's a really, really powerful example. This book is great and it's fabulous, and I'm very much going to recommend it to a lot of my students and assign it in a lot of my classes. But again, it's not perfect. No book is. And so there are a few questions that I had that I'd love for you to respond to, or to get the discussion going among here. So one thing that I want to know more about is, the theory in the empirics suggests that bureaucratic structure is, in a sense, uniform across the state. But my question is, why, if a leader faces a domestic issue, a domestic threat, why would we expect that the leader to change the structure of the country's defense bureaucracy? A bureaucracy or agency that deals with external security. Why can't a leader, God forbid, have specific institutional structures for domestic issues versus international ones? Perhaps you could make the argument in more authoritarian regimes where domestic issues also require some sense of social control of the population, that domestic and international issues are very, very much linked. But I had a harder time buying that argument or that logic for more democratic cases. Another question that I wanted to hear more about is, you know, especially when we think about leaders who have to deal with domestic issues, in a sense, if they're worried about these domestic issues, then how does the fact that, you know, there's only 24 hours in a day matter? That if they're really worried about their domestic legacy or domestic issues, then they're fundamentally just going to be spending less time with bureaucrats in internal security apparatuses and the Secretary of Defense, that kind of thing. I guess it's not so much a critique, but I guess I just wanted to hear more about that. How does that affect, you know, the amount of time and the mental energy and the mental capacity that leaders spend there? I'll end really briefly by saying that for those of you guys who do get a chance to read this book, it was actually one of the more pleasurable readings that I've had in a while. Tyler writes very, very beautifully with really compelling prose. And like the best works of fiction, there are nuggets in phrases that just kind of stick with you. One of my favorites was this quote that he wrote, optimism rooted in inaccuracy. And I was like, that is the story of my life.
Right?
I have all this optimism, but it's completely inaccurate because of my inaccurate understandings of what I can do with my time or my capacities. Or pernicious restrictions on our ability to know how conflicts will turn out. Just these great turns of phrases that make it very, very easy to read such a big book. Yeah, and I'll stop with one final thing, kind of related to the election here in the U.S. But again, talking about the Johnson chapter, there was this paragraph in which Tyler, again, showing like the deep historical archival work that Tyler did. But after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson believed that he, quote unquote, needed to keep the advisory team that he inherited rather than appointing his own in order to maintain his, quote, link with the fallen president. Without them, Johnson calculated he would have had, quote, absolutely no chance of gaining the support of the media or the Easterners or the intellectuals. And as a result, would have, quote, no chance of governing the country. I was just thinking, oh, how times have changed. So thank you for that. Looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Hassan. Now, last by no means least, Professor Moffitt, who is our own chair of political science here at Brown and does American politics.
I
not
do.
comparative politics.
And to echo a theme that my panelists have already emphasized, this book transcends subfields. It transcends time. It transcends space. Thank you for writing this book. And thank you because it also invited, because of its transcendence, it invited me to reconsider a passage of from Machiavelli's The Prince that I've been mulling over for decades, when he writes, "A prince who is not wise cannot be well advised." And I've wondered about this. What is wisdom? What would it look like if I saw it? And Tyler has an answer for that. Look to the bureaucrats, right? But look to the structure, right? When we look to the choices as a way into that puzzle, what accounts, what helps a prince be wise or not just the personality, as you emphasize, but look at the structures, look at the institutional designs and the choices that help us. I want to highlight and echo some of the comments that my colleagues here have made about why you should buy this book. Holidays are right around the corner. Stocking stuffers for all. I teach a course on public bureaucracy here at Brown at the doctoral level. I see some students in the audience. It's a mix of Americanists, comparativists, and IR students. And why it works so well in that class too is because it transcends the subfields. You are speaking to an enduring puzzle, right? Over conflict, miscalculation. Why do states start conflicts that they ultimately lose? This is, of course, a big IR question, but it's a question that we think about at many different levels of governance. It doesn't just have to be the big state conflict question. to puzzle over this. I was puzzling over this morning with my children, right? Why did I enter into this conflict, which I have now just lost? But in all seriousness, the framework that Tyler has offered by asking a big question about conflict and then looking to institutional choices and the bureaucrats within them is what pervades different levels. This is not just an IR question. It's not just an IR book. And also, by looking at the bureaucrats, you're looking at a level of policymaking and action that is pervasive. I think estimates suggest that in the moment, 90% of policies in the United States are made by the bureaucrats. That might not be the case in January, but at the moment, bureaucratic policymaking is pervasive. So you have a big question, and you're looking to an architecture that harnesses important and pervasive parts of the process. Second, I do want to emphasize, as my colleagues have mentioned here, this book marshals impressive evidence. It goes, 20,000 feet and looks at it over regimes and over time, but then it gets down into the micro level with truly impressive archival evidence. And to echo Mai's comment on the writing, I would go a bit further and say that this is a page turner, right? I knew very little about the regimes and the countries and the context in which you wrote, and I couldn't put it down. And I just kept making it all about me and my agencies in the U.S. that I study, and saw lots of parallels. Excellent writing, excellent research on a big question. More than quibbles and critiques, I see lots of pathways here for ongoing conversation. And that's a piece of what I want to put on the table. And some of these are conversations that you and I have already started, and I very much look forward to continuing them. One of the things I liked about this book is how it offers a very different answer to the puzzle than Amy Ziegert's answer in Flying Blind. Now, I see referenced a lot in here, flawed by design. But I was thinking about how this pushes well beyond Flying Blind, which offers an organizational answer to why do we fail, not an institutional one, but she goes deep into the organizations themselves, their incentive structure and their culture, as well as their design to answer in that question, right? Why 9/11? Why, what explains that failure? But, I'm just wondering, as you move forward and think about it, is there a way that you can think about the constellation of entities here and what's going on in their component parts? Do the organizations, more about the internal organizations, matter here? Especially in terms of the quality of information that they produce, which is a point that I'll revisit later. So is the answer just institutional, or are there elements of organizations that we also need to attend to? And while I'm persuaded that there is an institutional answer here, I also found myself getting a little tripped up on the way institutions are discussed here. It could just be also my orientation in political science, but I think of institutions as durable and sticky. They are the rules that define what they do, but they persist. And so when I encountered parts of the argument that we find that changes in institutional design are strikingly frequent, that challenged me to think about institutions, like how sticky are they here? And when they're not sticky, does that move us back into the space of organizations and not institutions? But then in your analysis also, I was thinking in chapter 3, you see the implications of institutional stickiness. And I wanted a little more there about how much time leaders have to spend dismantling the institutions they inherited. The choices that they make are never get a blank slate. How much of it's not just the domestic, political terrain that they inherit, but they inherit the institutional architecture. And I just want a little bit more about how that bears on the subsequent choices that they make. And then the last piece that I would just love to be in conversation about is what happens when we can no longer assume that expertise and capacity lie within the agencies. Absolutely persuaded that when we have diverse engagement, when the information is coming from experts with information, that diversity absolutely matters to better decision making. I was delighted to see the Scott Page references in there. That work has influenced my own as well. But it rests on the assumption that there is expertise. It rests on the assumption that there is capacity. Maybe I'm spending too much time in American public bureaucracy, but I worry about that assumption. And I just wonder, like, what implications might that have for your framework and your argument if we can't assume expertise and capacity? But overall, excellent book. Thank you so much for writing it. And I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. So Tyler, do you want to respond to some of these many trenchant comments and questions?
Yes, but only the positive ones.
Okay.
No, I think it might be helpful to come in and start a dialogue now. So first of all, thank you all for engaging with the book, and I appreciate the. It's humbling to hear some of the things being said, but I'll sort of focus on my comments on the questions that were posed, and so starting with Yuhua's. So I think that you're right that there is a baseline difference between democracies and autocracies. The way that I think about it is not that the information transmission problem is fundamentally different, but the parameter of the leader's ability and flexibility to impose higher costs on behavior that they do not like is obviously higher, or there's more flexibility in an authoritarian regime. In the United States, in a democracy, most democracies, at least institutionalized democracies, if a bureaucrat resigns in protest, the tools available to a president to impose countervailing costs are limited relative to what Mao was able to do to the bureaucracy, right? That's an understatement, of course. So I do think about that as important. What's not clear for me is whether that cost parameter, like which way it cuts in terms of the quality of information that's extracted. There's a kind of assumption in the Weintraub tradition, I think, that because the costs are high, that necessarily means that the information that comes up will be of lower quality. I'm not convinced that's the case in every instance, right? Because if the leader is able to signal to the bureaucracy that what they will punish is defection from accurate information or truthful information, right? Then it can actually cut in a positive direction. So I think it does come back to the signals that leaders send through institutional design to the bureaucratic organization, which way those costs cut. That being said, and I do have a kind of get out of jail free paragraph in the conclusion where I do think this is an important area for future research. And it could be the case that future scholars come along and say, no, actually, like this thing that Tyler overlooked really does cut in a fundamentally different direction. I would be open to research that said that. On his second question about whether or not, like how it makes sense for a vertical information flow to become part of the domestic political calculation that leaders have in institutional design. So I think like a really illustrative example in this regard comes from the section on Johnson's choice to adopt. So the chapter on the escalation in Vietnam starts with Johnson's institutional design choices, in particular, his choice to push aside the National Security Council and establish this thing in parallel called the Tuesday Luncheon, a very informal venue which had no staffing, couldn't have paperwork, and which restricted significantly the number of bureaucrats and types of bureaucracies that were afforded access to the president. And you can see quantitatively, it's like a pretty dramatic shift in who had access. If you look closely at the way that Johnson described this choice in subsequent interviews with Doris Kearns Goodwin, he said that even those, even those kind of vertical interactions, right? The president asking questions is a type of information sharing downward, right? We think that it might be possible to create stylized situations in which there's only upward transmission, but the downward transmission associated with, and in this case, Johnson used the example of National Security Council meetings. Why did he do this? Well, he knew that every time he held a National Security Council meeting, the information would leak out into the press. He would see it the next day. And so the reason why he shifts over is he knew he could control the Tuesday luncheon and prevent even that kind of the sort of downward or top-down empowerment of the bureaucracy in terms of the information they have access to. That third party, that ability to shape a broader debate is important. I'll come back to that in a second and answering one of Mai's questions. For the Trump appointment question, I think it's a yes and question. Obviously, this book is focused on institutions, rules, procedures, so on and so forth. But I think it would be an overstatement to say that personnel don't matter. I have other research that does actually show that dispositions, personalities, all of advisors who get access to presidents or other leaders can be actually quite consequential. So I think it's a yes and. For Mai's questions, so those are I'll skip over the positive ones. On to the two questions. So about the uniformity of bureaucratic structure. So I think about it in a slightly different way. I do actually think that you can have different structures for domestic affairs and international ones. I think this is part of the reason why information during the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s gets so bad, while at least in my account, the international sphere doesn't get quite as bad as quickly. What I meant to argue in this regard is it's the national security bureaucracy's ability to weigh in on a broader domestic debate that's either happening in an authoritarian regime amongst an elite or in a democratic society amongst a broader populace. And so to take the Johnson example a step further, right, the reason that Johnson was so worried about leaks in the context of the mid-1960s is he was worried that that would cause him to lose support for the domestic legislation he wanted to put through. And he frames this in subsequent interviews in very stark terms, that if I do not if I don't sort of contain my advisor's ability to punish me, I'm going to lose things like the Civil Rights Act and the Great Society. So that's the way that I think about the way that the national security bureaucracy becomes a domestic political player, even if there are sort of separate ways of handling those two sets of bureaucratic organizations. Moving to Susan's, so first of all, I do want to say that Prince quote is fantastic. I actually wish I had known about that because I probably would have included it in the intro. And the reason why is because a frequent question that I get, particularly in the 1999 Cargill case, is a critique of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's strategic judgment, and essentially just saying, isn't it the case that this historical example, this historical blunder, is explained by the fact that Nawaz Sharif had a hard time sort of getting things done and sometimes seemed completely non-responsive to what individuals would tell him. But this your kind of reflection on Prince, on Machiavelli, is exactly my counter, although made much more eloquently and pithily, in that leaders shouldn't have to rely solely upon their strategic judgment, right? A well-governed society, a well-governed state should provide for them a set of institutions that ease the burden of having to navigate a very complex and uncertain international environment. And so it's not as if strategic judgment doesn't matter. Personality, of course, matters. But we can moderate that based upon the institutional choices that are made. In terms of Amy Ziegart's scholarship, I do think it's really interesting. I kind of came at it from the opposite direction. When I started looking hard in graduate school at the literature on bureaucracy, I thought they had sort of like the starting point for the existing literature, going back to Allison, was this kind of bottom-up approach in which you think about bureaucracy primarily in terms of street-level bureaucrats inside of the national security space. And so if you think about Graham Allison's perspective, right, what is he talking about? Well, he's talking about street-level decisions that Air Force commanders, that naval commanders are making that are getting in the way of what Kennedy wants to get out of the crisis. I thought what would be interesting, and this is sort of why my starting point is the leader in this book, is to like take a top-down approach and say, let's not sort of start with the bureaucracy and work our way up. Let's start with the leader who we know who is actually really important to making the most consequential choices. If you think back to Krasner's critique of Allison in 72 or whatever it is, right? His critique is that it's all about the leaders. Well, let's take Krasner at face value. Let's say it's about leaders, but then work our way down. And so that's sort of how I think about the interaction with Siegert. In terms of institutional stickiness, it's just like fundamentally true that the institutions, organizations are quite sticky. I think when you invert the perspective and begin with the leader and work your way down, it does make more sense that institutions can respond at quicker pace. Why is that? Well, leaders get a heck of a lot of room to maneuver in terms of what their daily schedule looks like, who they interact with, the rules surrounding those interactions. And so from that perspective, it's perhaps, at least to me, a little less puzzling that the institutions can change at quicker clip. I think where a lot of the stickiness comes from that we observe in the analysis actually comes from the factors, the parameters in the theory remain quite stable over time in a lot of polities. So, for example, I think, within the United States, the bureaucracy, I don't think through much of the Cold War, and this is why Johnson is in many ways an anomaly, posed a direct threat to political power, which sort of made integrated institutions a natural choice in the US context. That obviously can be complicated, and the severity of threat exists on a continuum, so on and so forth. But where I see stickiness coming from is the underlying variables that shape politics, and therefore the leaders' institutional choices. The last point you make regarding expertise and capacity, it's a great one. And I think one of the interesting things is when leaders try to legitimate hollowing out the bureaucracy, they will often make the claim that there is no expertise, there is no capacity that is being offered here. And I think it's an empirical question at the end of the day. I think the analysis in the book suggests that there is something, all else equal, that the bureaucracy is able to provide to leaders. But certainly one could make the case that it's not, and we should sort of empirically adjudicate between those two.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative for a second and push you a little bit on the last answer, because I think it's really relevant to the current discussion about Trump's reorganization of the government and Susan's point about expertise. So what happens when a leader takes a sledgehammer to a bureaucracy, right? Yesterday, NPR reported firing 500 people in the NIH. What happens if you eliminate the DOE entirely? What happens if you politicize the DOJ to the extent that there is nothing but a loyalist and no expertise? I think it's remarkable to think about somebody under current indictment being the attorney general. I mean, so like if you think about what happens when you actually take a sledgehammer to these organizations that are supposed to provide expertise, what is the consequence of that? Are we just, okay, you're now in an autocracy and that's the end of the story? Or you provide additional evidence about the way bureaucracies work in authoritarian regimes. And so it's probably unfair to ask you just in light of Trump, but it's very hard not to think about your argument in light of Trump. So I'm very curious what your thoughts are about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the theoretical thrusts of the book is this idea that we can think about institutions regulating the space between leaders and bureaucracies as separate from those regulating the relationship between state and society. So just because there are changes to bureaucratic institutions within the United States doesn't necessarily make the United States automatically an autocracy. It's just a democracy with a different set of bureaucratic structures in place. But there is the question of sort of whether or not this theory can speak to hollowing out of bureaucratic organizations as opposed to changing the institutions connecting leaders and bureaucracies. And so to be clear, and this is a kind of nuance that you would have to read the book to tease out, but you saw it on the 2x2 that I presented. The left and right dimension wasn't the bureaucratic capacity. It was connective tissue between leaders and bureaucratic organizations, which is slightly different, right? You could have connective tissue to a relatively lean bureaucracy, or you could have connective tissue to a sprawling one. And the book doesn't directly evaluate whether or not the magnitude or the size of the bureaucracy makes or has an effect on the propensity for miscalculation. That being said, some of the cases from China do have these things working in tandem, and it does seem that the hollowing out of the bureaucracy itself, particularly during the Cultural Revolution, had a quite similar chilling effect. And so just to give a little bit of historical context, right? So something like 70% of diplomats who were stationed in Beijing in the mid and late 1960s were sent down as part of the Cultural Revolution to the countryside to sort of think about their political transgressions, learn from the countryside, learn from the people, develop a revolutionary experience, so on and so forth. All but one of China's ambassadors were recalled from abroad in order to participate in the Cultural Revolution at home. That's a kind of hollowing out of capacity. And some accounts do say that, this is related to, or this had a chilling effect upon what individuals were willing to say. So it's not a huge stretch for me to say, even though the scholarship, I don't think directly tackles the question, but it's not a huge stretch for me to say that it could have analogous effects.
Thank you. I'd like to open up questions to the audience, see if people have comments or questions for Tyler or any of the other panelists. Yes, Lyle.
Yeah, thanks for this great session, and great. I'm excited about this book. I've read a lot of Professor Jost scholarship and taught it in my class, and the students are really get a lot out of it, as have I. So I have huge expectations for the book. Let me ask you a couple, though, kind of tough questions, if you will. And I've read a lot of your case study. I agree with the panel that your archival work is amazing, and I commend you on that, particularly in really tough cases like in getting into Chinese archives is next to impossible. But is there, I'm still having trouble, though, with the case selection. Let me ask you two very basic, and I know there's a good logic here, but it seems a bit of apples and oranges when I look at the Vietnam War, and then which cost millions of lives, a lot of Americans, destroyed a country, destroyed a couple of maybe 3 countries, if you can include everything. Went on for 10 years. The carnage was just, one cannot be too over the top in describing it. And then comparing that to, say, Cargill crisis, or in the 69 episode, which I happen to know a lot about and have written about, between China and the USSR. Maybe 1,000 people died, or maybe 2,000 at the most. And it was, it's hard to call it more than a large skirmish. And so when we're comparing a war and a skirmish, I think it's difficult, to say the least. And I would agree that the consequences of that skirmish were very large, no question about it, including for Chinese domestic politics and all that. But anyway, so how do you address that question? And then I'm also struck by your comment that Johnson is an anomaly in American foreign policy. I wish that were the case, but I mean, of course, we have a really pretty sad record of failures. You know, do I need to go down the list? I mean, Ukraine is not looking good, folks, but Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, Libya. I mean, it's a long list of failure, maybe getting longer as we speak. Your general take on our system? You know, do we have this kind of ideal or integrated decision making that's effective? Thanks.
Should we take a couple of questions?
Sure. Are there others? People, Ashu?
Machiavelli has already been mentioned. Let me also say that Thomas Hobbes is speaking out, or maybe jumping out, and directly relates to the way you're formulating the relationship between leaders and bureaucracy, right? So there's a Hobbesian element in IR, but in comparative politics, the argument basically is that powerful states and or leaders can significantly reshape society, which would also include reshaping bureaucracies, including hollowing out, etc. Now, you could say that Hobbes was writing during the English Civil War, and it was particularly the idea of how the states can reshape, or leaders can reshape society or bureaucracies, or the whole organizational machinery at their disposal, was governed by the Civil War moment. And in a more normal moment, bureaucracies would dominate or would shape leaders much more. Do you have some kind of, you did say that in some of your work, leaders are jumping out as more important or very important. Do you have some kind of typology in mind? It cannot be said that leaders always overrule bureaucracy and will not be governed by bureaucracy, will not be governed by societal forces or so. But there's also, we know, moments when leaders reshape societies, reshape bureaucracy, reshape governmental machinery. So, I mean, would you have, for example, in mind revolutionary autocracy as opposed to autocracy? Now, Mao is very different from lots of other bureaucrats, autocrats, right? He's leading a revolution, which will have serious impact on both how the state is structured or restructured, the imperial state, and how society will be restructured, right? And maybe that's sort of functionally equivalent to how Hobbes is thinking about civil war and reshaping England after that, right? So just a thought, are you thinking of some kind of typology where you can show the relative power of these two constituents that are very important for you, the political leadership and the bureaucratic organization?
The person in front of you had a question too, so why don't we take that one and then you can reply.
I think you can for the talk is really interesting. I guess I wanted to ask specifically about so fundamentally at the core there's an assumption that bureaucracy sort of fail at the war, sort of as if there's an assumption that the national interest is sort of like a unified, like, oh, there is one like either you win, or you succeed, or you fail. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I mean, like, I was thinking about in the case of the United States, for example, like, at least to my knowledge, the United States has not won like a major war since World War II, for example, but yet different factions, different interests within the United States, you know, they have benefited from various wars, you know, like, I mean, like the military-industrial complex didn't benefit from wars, you know, and then famously, like in Iraq, like one thing that happened was like, you know, troops like we, you know, guarded like the oil fields, so then, you know, I guess big oil interests would, you know, benefit from this. So I was wondering if you could maybe just talk a little bit more about, you know, what your thoughts are specific about, like, you know, competing national interests as opposed to the idea of whether bureaucracies have, you know, some sort of like either you succeed in this war or you don't.
Great. Yeah. So maybe I'll take the three sets of questions, and I'll do it in reverse order. So the assumption that the national interest is unified, it's not, and obviously, you know, it's a 15-minute presentation trying to distill down however many pages it was. But it's not quite right. The assumption here is from the leader's point of view, they have certain objectives when they enter into a crisis or conflict. And the evaluation is sort of how they do along those dimensions. What I think the question does implicitly get at is an alternative model of understanding miscalculation that is rooted in, and this is my way of sort of making Allison's third model, for those of you familiar with the book, more studyable, which is, I call it the interest group model, right? And so the interest group model would essentially posit that, as Allison said, it's the most powerful bureaucracy gets its way in policy. And from that perspective, like they get the most out of the crisis, even if from the leader's perspective or other bureaucratic organizations, they don't, right? And so it's interesting. It's a totally plausible proposition. It's one that I try to empirically evaluate. I find evidence of it in a couple of the cases, but the dominant theme is really not that. It's about the ability of bureaucracies to persuade and inform. Another way of thinking about this is like an interest group model, and I think this is one of the deficits inside of Allison's framework. It's not clear where the leader sits, right? It goes back to Krasner's critique, right? It's a sort of like, well, you have bureaucracy A, B, and C, and they all have different preferences, and the most powerful one gets its way. But where the leader sits, right, and the leader, if we take the assumption that I make in the book as right, gets to make the final choice about whether or not they're going to approve or not. One of those bureaucracies has to be able to say, boss, this is going to work, and get them to buy in. It's possible, of course, that an alternative conceptualization of this, it's all about coercion, right? And so the way in which influence is regulated is one bureaucracy's ability to punish the leader. But the sort of institutional design story cuts against that, because the argument here is that the leader uses designs in order to push away bureaucracies that they don't, fear is going to punish them, rather than making concessions to them in the policy domain. But it's possible that both exist. I just find comparatively little evidence for the interest group model. For Ashu's question, which I sort of distilled down into two, the first is the question about a kind of parallel typology, which would give rank order of the leader's level of influence or leader's level of impact upon the choice. So if you think through the model, it sort of makes sense, I think, this is what I find empirically to be the case, that insular institutions tend to be the one in which leader personality traits are most expressed, right? Because if it's a sort of simple math, right? If the bureaucracy is pushed out, then the decision maker who gets to make the choice between war and peace has maximum room to express what they think, their worldview, their operational code, to use the term that Alex George coined a long time ago. In terms of the kind of revolutionary nature of the regime, I absolutely think this is really important for two reasons. In terms of the China case, it's actually really counterintuitive from a certain point of view, right? Mao, as a revolutionary, should, we think, be kind of antagonistic towards bureaucracy, and in some of his rhetoric, he is. And yet, when we take this institutional perspective, it's actually pretty collegial for much of the 1950s, which to me was kind of fascinating, very, very interesting to me. I actually do think that the reason for that is rooted in a sort of Levitskian reading of what revolutions do. And by that, I mean, I'm referencing his most recent book, The Durability of Revolutionary Regimes. And I think part of the reason why Mao was able to adopt comparatively integrated institutions in the 1950s is the fact that the bureaucracy is simply not a threat to him. He has a tremendous amount of charisma. He has a tremendous amount of support within the party. He has, through rectification campaigns in the 1940s, pushed those that were, had different political views out and demonstrated his power. And so he sits sort of atop, reigning supreme. And so I do think revolution is quite important in that way. I think it's important in another way as well. And this is something the book doesn't look at a ton, but speaks to Susan and Mai's earlier points about the kind of sociological aspects of bureaucratic organizations. It was the case, I think, in 1950s China that Mao didn't have to work particularly hard to get information to flow horizontally at the apex of government, because these were people who all knew each other. They had fought in the revolution together. They lived side by side. There are these stories of Peng Dehuai and Zhang Wentian, like sharing, and one military general and a diplomat, sharing information late at night because they like shared a compound wall. Reportedly, that could be apocryphal. It's not. I don't think it's in the book, but. In any case, so I do think, the revolutionary nature of regimes does matter, although it doesn't necessarily play out in the way that we would think. For Lyle's questions, so I'll take the first one that you posed first in terms of case selection. So it's important to recognize the limits of what the theory is trying to tackle. Like the theory is interested in miscalculation, and you can miscalculate the costs. But the consequence of that can either be really high, right? It can be a war like Vietnam that is incredibly consequential, or it can be, as you said, and I think I would agree with this, that the Sino-Soviet border conflict in comparison is quite a bit smaller. That being said, I mean, we could sort of debate whether or not, if we sort of accept that there was nuclear mobilizations in the fall of 1969, or the fact that Kargil is fought between, it's the only instance of two nuclear powered states entering into direct conflict with one another. It's interesting, and not obvious to me that the costs are as low as the question would imply. But I take the point about more scholarship needing to be entered into the record about the cost dimension here, as opposed to the purely sort of forward-looking calculation and miscalculation dimension. In terms of the record of failures in the United States. Setting aside the sort of like quibbles about which one of the ones that you listed were successes or failures, or which ones were miscalculations or not, I think the point that the book is trying to make with regard to the United States is not to argue that integrated institutions it's not possible to miscalculate in them, right? Of course it is. All of these things are probabilistic. And so I think there's a tendency when we evaluate the US national security institutions, and I actually find this to be the case in India as well. There is a rushed judgment that because we observe certain miscalculations, that the system must be fundamentally flawed. But there's an alternative version out here, which is that if there was a different institutional design, it could have actually resulted in a lot more. And the statistical analysis in the book would actually suggest that that's the case. So it could have been even worse than it was, again, assuming that the codings that you offer are correct.
Yes.
Just to concur and maybe echo, the last observations. And outcome do matters, right? And so if most American foreign war doesn't have really desirable outcome, does information really matters? Talk about the information for democracy, leadership. And it's other factors like ideology or national interest maybe play more significant role than the information from below. Or they concur with each other.
Should we take?
Are there other questions?
Can I do a few figures? No?
Sure.
So there is another version of the, thank you for explaining the Mao, the revolutionary and the state. That was wonderful. So you're basically saying the attack on bureaucracy began either during the Great Leap Forward or during the Cultural Revolution. Basically, Cultural Revolution, I think, is your argument. Not earlier than that. Okay. So there is, in the current literature that is emerging about politicians and state institutions, bureaucracies, the populists are viewed as all of them against either it's called the deep state, or they want to fundamentally restructure state institutions to achieve their objectives. Whether it's Modi, whether it's Trump emerging once again, whether it's Erdogan, whether it's all of them are making roughly the same argument: discipline the state institutions, or get rid of them, or show them their place, whatever the language is. So other than revolutionaries trying to reshape societies, there is also this new version of politician emerging. And in Europe, it's been talked about for much longer. Much longer, but right-wing populism basically is born there, right? For all practical purposes. And left-wing populism in Latin America and spreading everywhere. So the populist leader might be an analytic object for you while discussing the relationship between bureaucracies and leaders. That's all, yeah.
I think Danny had a question, and there may have been somebody else. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the panel. I think it's a very important book. I very much look forward to reading it. My question, the first one is about to what extent the social political or political economic system helps us understand the concepts of autocracy and democracy. For example, does socialist system and capitalist system make a difference when we think about these two terms, right? So that relates to the revolutionary side, right? So the previous professor already talked about. And also in China, yes, the bureaucracy, say 1950s, there are parallel institutional structures. You have a party line, right, which also kind of institutionalized, but it is separated from the state, which perhaps mostly understood as bureaucracy, right? So we see these two structures very often do not really go hand in hand, especially during the Cultural Revolution. And then on top of that, Mao Zedong is also very special because several times he kind of defied both the party and the state, right? Making direct appeal to the masses, right? So I think he kind of believes in, very much like Rosa Luxemburg's theory about, the revolutionary spontaneity of the masses. So he can just go outside the party and making direct appeal to the masses. And that's part of the cultural revolutionary, cultural revolution story. So I'm just wondering, right? So at least we have three different kind of, possibilities in social China, and that it is also a socialist system. And also negotiating with, USSR, that kind of structure, and Western, capital structure. So I'm wondering to what extent your book, addresses that kind of complexity, right? And that also complicates our understanding of, autocracy versus democracy. Yeah.
I think Danny, and then we'll go to Becky.
Thank you so much, and congratulations. I think you're arguing that bureaucratic quality declines when the leader needs support for their domestic agenda, and if we often also observe that leaders start crises when they need support for the domestic agenda. So I think Chen Jian argues that Mao started and also I think Alex Downs argued that Johnson started the Vietnam War for the Great Society program. So if that's the case, I think we might observe a baseline correlation between crises and the decline in bureaucratic quality. Is that the case? Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So I'll take I have 4 questions. I'll go in reverse order. So I think you're absolutely right to cue on the idea that there could be a kind of diversionary or mobilization effort associated with crisis, and that could be related to some of the transformative domestic political agendas. So we should be wary when we're evaluating these claims and look at them side by side. So I try to do that in the book. I think, and I'll use the example of Lyndon Johnson, because I think, and obviously you have just a couple of seconds to articulate the idea, but I think that is perhaps not the most accurate way of understanding the way in which the Great Society program and the Civil Rights Act shaped Johnson's decision-making in 64 and 65. it's not obvious to me that either for a kind of diversionary reason or for a mobilization reason, Johnson is intentionally trying to stir up some sort of conflict in Vietnam. On the contrary, he feels constrained and has, he uses kind of vulgar language to describe this at points, but like he feels he has no choice but to deal with this really bad situation that he's facing. If left to his own devices, I'm firmly convinced that Johnson would have preferred that the United States didn't have its reputation on the line in 1964-65, right? Because it would have allowed him to focus on the things that he really cared about domestically. The kind of extension of this, of course, is that, and this is the reason why the Johnson case is so fascinating, right? Because Johnson is an incredibly adept politician, one of the most adept politicians that we had in the second half of the 20th century. And yet it is this one thing, the choice to escalate in Vietnam, that ends up costing him his ability to run successfully in 68. So he selects out of it because he knows he's up against it. The irony here, of course, is that if it was a domestic political mobilization process, we would expect, right, and not a miscalculation, we would sort of expect that not to play out exactly that way. Going to the question about the sort of socialist nature of the Chinese regime, I think obviously any country within the authoritarian or democratic space is rich in the way in which it's organized, the way in which its economy functions, the political history and legacies that complicate all of these things. I guess I don't view the contribution of the book as trying to think about the interaction between this bureaucratic dimension that I'm interested in and, say, the socialist nature of the regime per se. I guess I see them as kind of separate ways to add nuance and richness to our understanding of the way that decision-making happens in China. What I would say, one of the things that you said what really resonated with me was the, sort of distinction between party apparatuses and state ones. What's really interesting is not just the fact, like one could take that as a baseline condition of siloing that makes it a little bit harder to let bureaucrats share information within the Chinese state. And I think there's some truth to that, right? If you have hard divisions between a party apparatus and a state apparatus, that does introduce some kind of elevated cost to horizontal sharing. That being said, what's really interesting is even in the 50s, there's a lot in place that kind of attenuates that. And so I think it's absolutely true that that exists, but it's not as if there aren't coordination mechanisms that could potentially solve it or at least lower the cost a little bit. Certainly when the party leaders talk about coordination problems within this party-state division, they oftentimes allude to this fact, right? So I think they're cognizant of some of the costs that the design of the broader structure imposes. To Ashu's second question about populism, so it's difficult to code any of these leaders that I look at as populist per se, but I've had the exact same thought. That the way I talk about it in the book is transformative domestic political agendas are the thing that push leaders towards these more fragmented institutions or insular institutions. If one were to want to categorize a populist agenda, at least at the present moment, I think it's reasonable to put it within the category that I talk about. And so it's entirely plausible that this kind of apprehension about class relations within a country and the state's role within that as kind of being on the side of elites that have abandoned the people, I can definitely see a narrative playing out there. The last, the very first question, I guess, last on my list in reverse order. I mean, it's obviously true that these outcomes matter. I wouldn't quibble there. The only thing I might add, or what the comment made me think about, was, the distinction between information and ideology. And it sort of depends on your definition of what an ideology is and how you think about the way it affects decision-making. I think about ideology from the perspective of like Alex George. Ideology is a set of beliefs that structure the way that an individual looks at the world and can make them resistant to new information coming in, either that they observe themselves or that the bureaucracy supplies to them.
And so I actually think there's a really interesting interaction between things like ideology or worldview or operational code in Alex George's terminology and information that is like this. This is what is actually really fascinating to me, not just about bureaucracy, but just about decision making in general.
Okay, I think that we're actually at the end of our time. So do any of the panelists have any final comments or reactions, or Tyler, do you have any final?
I would just say thank you again. I really enjoyed the discussion and really appreciate you taking the time to engage with the scholarship.
Yeah, and let's all of us congratulate Tyler on a really remarkable achievement.